Once upon a time, there was a land called the Pointed Land. It was called that because everything had a point. All the buildings were pointed. They pointed with sharp points to the sky, but some of them had points sticking out of them, which meant that people bumped into them and were hurt by them. All the people who lived in the land had points on the top of their head. So everything was pointed in the Pointed Land. Even vegetables that were round were grown so that they could be pointed, and the ones that weren't pointed were rejected. Into that land, a lovely couple called Jim and Alice were looking forward to the birth of their first child. They had longed for a child for so long. And when the birth came, they were excited, so excited. And as the head emerged, there was no point. Their lovely baby girl had no point on the top of her head. What to do? Well, the doctors were quite clear about what to do. She would be pointless. She would never have a life. There'd be no place for her. People would laugh at her. People would bully her. On they went about what the dreadful life that their child would have. She would have to be put away. They had special places for children like her, where they kept them away from the pointful people. These were the asylums for the pointless. But Jim and Alice had longed for this child. She was their child. And she said, no, we're going to have her. We're going to make beautiful hats, which will disguise the fact that she has no point. They will be lovely, and people will admire them. The doctors were sceptical. People will discover she will have no place. She will have no point. But Alice and Jim won, and they made pointed hats in beautiful colours for their daughter, who they called Ublia. Well, Ublia grew up in the land of points, the Pointed Land. She grew up in a group of women with her hat firmly in place, so nobody could see that she was pointless. The national game of the Pointed Land was called triangle toss. This involved a very pointed triangle, open triangle, and people had to catch it on their point on their head. It was a game not open for women to play. And it brought in a lot of fame and a lot of fortune. And the chief player was Maximus. Maximus, the son of the ruler of the land. Maximus was the champion. But the women were sad at not being able to play the game. And so they were forming a women's group of triangle toss players. Ublia was in that group, and they were her friends. It took her a long time before she revealed that she had no point. But fortunately for her, she had a very faithful dog called Fido. And the girls and the women of the society got together, and they thought that they could make it right for Ublia and be able to play the triangle toss if Fido sat on her head and the triangles were caught by Fido. So skilled were the combination of Fido and Ublia that they challenged Maximus to a contest. Well, Maximus thought this was a stupid contest. Of course, he'd meet a stupid woman who didn't have any point anyway. So off they went. But the combination, the cooperation between Ublia and Fido defeated Maximus. This did not please Maximus's father. And the result of it was that he banished Ublia and Fido to the pointless forest. So off they went. And they discovered that there the trees were not all pointed. Some of them were, but some of them were round and had round leaves. They dropped their leaves, and the leaves fertilized the earth underneath the trees. And when they looked at the earth, they saw round creatures like worms and snakes in the earth, burrowing through the earth. And they realized that in general they were round, and that the earth needed round creatures in order to exist. They met a man who did have lots of points because he was made of rocks, but he was looking for his heart, which he'd lost somewhere. And then out of the woodland came 3 fat women, and they danced, and they danced, and they danced. And Fido and Ublia had a wonderful time joining in the dance. They met a tree who said that if all the trees were the same shape, the diversity of the forest would be indeed pointless, and showed them that all these creatures that they'd met all had a point. They all had a place and a point. After several nights in the forest, Fido and Ublia woke up one morning, and there was a hand in front of them pointing in the direction that they should go. And as they followed the direction of the hand, it led back to the pointed land. Ublia was no longer wearing her hat, and she came back telling of her journey in the pointless forest, and that it was untrue that anybody or anything was pointless. Everything had a point and a meaning. Well, the people of the pointed land had already staged a rebellion against their dreadful ruler and his son, and they hailed Ublia and her story as a heroine. And as they did this, all the pointed buildings started to grow into rounder shapes and started to grow deeper into the earth and stopped being precariously rooted into the sky. And the 3 fat women from the forest appeared, and they danced their liberating dance, and everybody joined in. Well, it gives me great pleasure to be talking to you today. Inclusive Church. And that story, which is based on one from a pop singer called Nilsson, but drastically readapted for this context, contains many of the elements that we're going to look at today in this lecture. How did we get to the point where many people were excluded from the church? Because Jesus's words is that the kingdom, and I shall use the word kingdom, of heaven is within. Not within one group of people, but within everyone. Over and over again, those are his words. The kingdom of heaven is embodied in the bodies of everyone, diverse as they are. And early Christianity, like its roots in Judaism, had no images, no human images of Jesus, just patterns and metaphors and things like that, the patterns that we see in Jewish and Islamic cultures. It was when it met the Greek culture and wanted to convert the Greeks and the Romans to it, we start to have images of a human Jesus in the model of Apollo, the young, athletic male god, and his father, Zeus, with a beard and so on. Once this happened, Christianity sold out to Greek thinking and lost the kingdom of heaven is within. Many of you will know the Platonic view of reality, the cave, which we're looking out of into a landscape where there's a perfect form of everything. Many of you will know that there's a perfect form of table to which all tables aspire. Well, I don't know whether tables are upset about not being the right table, but certainly it's done human beings no good. That perfect form of the human being, perhaps epitomized in many of the Renaissance sculptures, like David, the young athletic male, white, and so on, has served the church very badly, as has the notion of order, which was put forward in the Pythagorean system of geometry, that there is a perfect order at the heart of the universe, and that we should aspire to that order, particularly in an area that I know a lot about, and that's music. And lots of claims are made for European music as being very close to this order. Well, in fact, at the time of Pythagoras, there were many other mathematicians setting out other forms of order, which were not accepted because Pythagoras had the ear of those in power. But all of those notions of perfect have had a disastrous effect on inclusion. The phrase that's been used to support this has been, "Be ye perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect." But the notion that we shall know what God regards as perfect is indeed a very dangerous one. And the question that a Swami, dealing with this particular phrase, said, how do we know what God regards as perfect? And indeed, if we go back to Jesus, God regards all the embodied shapes of human beings as God-given. And so this Greek notion, which became part of Christianity, I think de-incarnating Christianity and giving it a philosophical edge rather than an incarnate edge, has been used for empire. It's been used to control people. It's meant that liturgy is tightly controlled. It has driven imperialism, wiping out the indigenous sounds and movements when it encounters them, and replacing them with European instruments and singing styles, to name but one aspect of it. And this has meant that more and more people, by reason of disability, age, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, financial position, and so on, have been pushed to the margins or out of it altogether. So how can Christianity regain the radical hospitality that characterized the ministry of Jesus? Well, radical hospitality is often interpreted as making people welcome, and indeed, of course, that's important. But it goes beyond that. It's not making people welcome and getting them to sit down and behave like we do in church. It's about asking what gifts these diverse groups of people in various embodied shapes bring, and how can those gifts be incarnated in our worship and find a place. This means that a lot of the order that we've prized so highly will be disrupted. The hymn I like least is "Thou whose almighty word chaos and darkness heard and took their flight." I think we need to have more chaos, more carnival in our worship, because that means that the diverse ways of knowing and being and the shapes of people will be acknowledged and celebrated. Let me give you some examples of what this might look like. In one of the churches in which I worship, we have a very lively 4-year-old. She's a scooter rider and the church is large. Periodically, on her scooter, she will appear suddenly from one side of the church, across in front of the chancel, and disappear in the other. Now, some people think that she should be under control. I think it's a wonderful symbol of the Holy Spirit, coming we know not when, exciting us for a little while, and then disappearing. What do we do with people in the late stages of dementia? Or indeed those with Tourette's, who are likely to offer words which may be not part of our liturgy? Is that not an example of everything being brought into worship? The whole of creation being brought in, including unusual words for some people present. And is that not what worship is about? Bringing the totality of our world into the liturgy. In the place where I worship too, there's an elderly woman who can no longer work, one of the elders of the church, no longer walk very well. And when on Pentecost Sunday, we have the reading of the gospel in various languages, the microphone comes to her and she reads it in Latin. Some of you will know Rachel Noel, who has introduced knitting and crocheting for people in church who find it difficult to concentrate, and so on. When we get to Prison Sunday, some people remark that we have a lot of talking from prison chaplains, but very seldom do we have ex-offenders talking about their experiences of prison. Why are they unwilling to share their stories? Are their stories not part of the incarnation story? What movements are permitted in worship? I was in Rome for a large service, and I saw all the cardinals and the priests moving their hands in various well-adjusted ways. We know how they all go, and so on and so forth. And then a concert was moved into the chapel, which involved young women singing and dancing. People said that they could not dance in that way in front of the altar. Why was one form of movement acceptable and another form of movement involving young women's bodies not acceptable? Who says that this movement is acceptable and this movement is not acceptable? Other traditions other than the Anglican and Protestant traditions, the Orthodox traditions with their icons, have people moving around freely for part of the service, kissing icons and lighting candles and so on. But the Protestant traditions have been particularly controlling of what goes on. I instituted in Winchester Cathedral a service called Space for Peace. No, it wasn't a service, it was a celebration called Space for Peace, where people of all the great faiths and none came, and in the middle section they sang all around the cathedral, choosing when they would sing. And the cathedral would mix the rabbi chanting Lamentations with the imam chanting the call to prayer, and the children singing, I Think to Myself, What a Wonderful World. And then they would come together and sing together. And people wandered around, praying, listening, sitting, contemplating, treating the event as they wanted to treat it. Freedom. Some people likened it to a celestial sweet shop. Carnival came into the church. How much carnival can we allow into the church? How much diversity can we accommodate? And how do we do it? That's the question I want to ask today. I've learnt a lot from Mary Magdalene, who I think represents another tradition in the church, which we lost, or indeed was dismissed relatively early in the history of the church, when she was put in a boat without a paddle and ends up in the Camargue. In the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, found of course in the Nag Hammadi find, we get this. After this, the Blessed One greeted them, saying, "Peace be with you. May my peace arise and be fulfilled within you. Be vigilant and allow no one to mislead you by saying, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is.' For it was within you that the Son of Man dwells. Go to him." And over again, in the visionary experiences of Mary Magdalene, we see Jesus, the teacher, appearing and saying that over and over again, it is within you. It is within you. Not within that person or this perfect person, but within you. Your body has that within you. And over again, in the area of inclusion, we've forgotten that message of Jesus. When you are scanning the face of the other, what do you see? What do you see? Do you see faith underneath the worn wrinkles? Do you see hope among blotches and scars? Do you see joy in the flick of an eyebrow? Do you see freedom behind iron bars? When you are scanning the face of the other, what do you see? What do you see? Do you see Christ in the fierceness of frowning? Do you see God in the brows furrowed lines? Is there the spirit beneath the exhaustion, freeing the soul from the living that binds? When you are scanning the face of the other, what do you see? What do you see? Jesus saw under the masks of a lifetime, saw through the fearing, the yearn of the heart, cut through the knotting of cultures dividing, with the deep incarnation that is wisdom's art. When you are scanning the face of the other, what do you see? What do you see? We would look deeply at faces before us, not be deceived by the differences there. Look with the eyes of the faith of respecting, seeing a world that is holy and fair. When you are scanning the face of the other, what do you see? What do you see? So, how far can we disrupt even our cultural perceptions of human bodies? Well, to a certain extent, the COVID crisis has disrupted our liturgy. Our beautiful priest at All Saints Tooting has been putting together wonderful films to represent the liturgy. May has put together people reading in their garden, people sending in films from Ghana, Nigeria, and people reading in their living rooms, setting up icons behind themselves, sometimes just sitting at their kitchen tables. So already COVID has brought into worship a whole load of stuff that we don't usually bring in. I love it. I've seen much more about the people around me in church than I did when I simply sat next to them in church. Ruth Wilde's lovely poem, God snuck home, no longer bound by the expectations of a consecrated building. She's concentrated her efforts on breaking out. Now, in the comfort of a well-worn dining table, she shares some bread with some friends, and she laughs, and she weeps in the sacred space of home. Well, if it's been opened up in that way, and we have seen the sacred place of home, how can we carry that on when we're back in the buildings? Are we going to return to liturgy and the concept of the church as we've seen it before? I want to share with you a poem that I wrote thinking about that. I was alone in the church. The vaults curved around me, and I heard a scratching on the roof, under the floor, on the door, and at all the windows. And there was a rushing mighty wind, and a figure flew in. I had not seen one like it before, for her flame filled the temple, and her skirt flowed with serpents. Her hair was filled with honeysuckle and old man's beard. Frogs leapt from her mouth and played gambolling around the statues. They found the font, and the figure sprayed water from her toes, and the font filled, and the frogs laughed and spewed out tadpoles. And some children rushed in and thought it was such fun. I saw that the floor was becoming transparent. I could see the traversing worms, the burrowing beetles, the termites and the ants. And then I noticed the roof was filling with birds. They were attached to the strings in her hair. Branches were growing out of the walls, and suddenly a fully grown oak tree leaped out of the floor. No sooner was it born than ivy started to wind itself around the trunk. And then I saw people were emerging from her belly, of every shape and every age. They hopped, they jumped, they crawled, they limped, they lay in her arms and started to find places in the corners of the church. And I noticed she was a woman struggling to birth all these creatures, for some were minute and some were huge. They contained every rainbow colour. Some were still, and some moved. Some appeared to be made of wood and stone, and the winding ivy and the honeysuckle fronds bound them tightly together. "Who are you?" I said, enveloped in the swirling of the multifarious creatures. And she replied, "I am the wild goddess. Thank you for letting me in. I have waited so long." She raised her hands, and the vines circled from them, dropping grapes. All were trodden, and the wheeled chairs ploughed over them. The juice flowed into the silver cups, which were appearing everywhere, shaped from buttercups and daffodils, and all drank together. "I am joy," she said, and we all laughed, and the sound filled the temple. Well, how far can we queer our sacred spaces? How much of the wildness can we let in? Queering the table has become a feature of queer theology. In the area of language, some of us have struggled to include inclusive language, and the pressure was much greater early in the noughties, or indeed in the 90s, than it is now. We did have a lot of material, but now we've reverted to the male, somewhat disembodied God, or with a very limited form of body. Some people have been concerned about the pursuit of light and the putting down of darkness, and what that has done for people who have darker colours. The notion of dark being evil and white being good has not done much good for people who have darker coloured skins. I want to look at music, because it's happened there with Pythagorean views of the right scale, of the being in tune with the universe, which I mentioned earlier, is actually just one way of seeing the universe, not necessarily the only way. Bertram Scher, in his work on queering congregational singing, has talked about how we've got disembodied notions of acoustics, which don't bear relations to the bodies of people who are there. Pythagoras was followed by Clement of Alexandria with the notion of the ordered body of Christ. And so we should be ordered because the body of Christ is ordered, and therefore we should be ordered. And that triumphant disembodied acoustic body of Christ has been excluding of many people. It's been an area of colonization, disciplining, and categorization into race, with particular tone color, class, the control of emotion, gender, pitch, ability to read, literacy, and by orders of voices that make bodies expendable. That notion of the perfect sound, epitomised by such places as King's College, Cambridge, and the 9 Lessons and Carols. A Jesuit monk in America, produced a wonderful statement. King's College, Cambridge has done for music what Barbie has done for women. Indeed, it's presented an impossible image for most people because it is male, it is white, it is expensive, and so on. And that rather than asking what the average church choir with 2 older women in it can do, the question is, why do they aspire to do the David Wilcox descants? Why do we not ask ourselves what any group of people liturgically can do and do well, rather than aspiring to do something other than that? To re-embody liturgy in the bodies of the people who are actually there at the time with a variety of gifts. Bertram Sher indeed talks about the vulnerability of people. Are we not allowed to share our vulnerability in church? For older women to sing, and indeed what some people would say in a much croakier, harsher voice, to allow the late stages of dementia to move through our songs and go through that. All of us have a mixed vocal range anyway, which changes during our life. Can we not include everyone and not have people say, I can't sing? What they mean is, I can sing, but not in a style that is acceptable in this particular church. So queer our singing and let everyone sing where they want to sing. Let older women sing in voices that are associated with maleness. That's particularly relevant when we get into the area of transgender and so on, where the transgender woman will have a voice that is encompassed, associated with men. Letting young men who want to sing in a soprano voice in their own falsetto, let them sing there. We had a wonderful young man doing that in one of our choirs at the university. He was coming to grips with his own sexuality and had been told by his school that he should sing in the proper male voice. But he challenged everything when we went to festivals, and the choir director would say, ladies, he'd put his hand up and say, I'm here. Wonderful challenge. Men and women of variety of ages, of disabilities, of shapes, able to sing where they are, even to sing in their vulnerable voice, the voice that we often exclude. So to finish, I think, what have I said about inclusion? That we have disembodied Christianity in favour of some ideal image, which is a philosophical image bearing very little relation except one of shame and guilt for the actual bodies in which God has chosen to frame us. That, of course, is true of many of the images of God that we have in our churches. The white male Christ has disempowered many, many people. And the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, beautiful it may be in aesthetic terms, reflecting a particular view of a particular culture, has done the incarnated essence of Christianity, the kingdom of God within everyone, no good. Indeed, Richard Dawkins may be right, that we have for a long time lived with a delusion, a God delusion. For unless God can be portrayed in a huge variety of images, almost that there is no image that cannot contain God, we need to revert to the pattern of our Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters of only using patterns. Because the reason that idolatry is so high in the list of the 10 Commandments is because it is exclusive. When you have only limited images of God, then people who don't subscribe to those feel excluded. I first met a female image of God with a body resembling mine, which is somewhat large, when I went to Malta and saw the goddesses with their heads chopped off, probably by the Christians. And in my 60s, I was then, I thought, I have been in the church for all of my life, and I have never seen an image of God that resembles me. What a tragedy. So I think we have to rethink our images. Although in the hymn I'm going to end with, I do say that I miss Father God, there's no reason why we shouldn't see God as a father. But we need to see God in a wheelchair, to see a black God, to see a female God, to see the God as a toddler, to see God as a person on a deathbed. We need those images, because if we don't have them, then all the people in those positions will feel excluded. That is not only in the words of our liturgy, but in the songs that we sing, and the way that we respond to people when they come. Are some of the people who come pointless, to go back to the story? Or does everyone have a point, have a particular gift to offer the liturgy? And how can we use that? Is that not the challenge? Do we not need to queer the liturgy? Not to ask how people can conform, how we can get people in wheelchairs up steps by ramps, but move the altar down, as Nancy Iceland suggests, so that everybody can get at it without any steps. Rethinking all that we've assumed to be essential, indeed perfect. To rethink perfection as diversity, unity as not uniformity. To admit what some people would call the chaos, or the vulnerability, or the brokenness, or the diversity of the body of Christ that we as human beings, and indeed the other than human world, represent. A child once loved the story which angel voices tell, how once the King of Glory came down on earth to dwell. Now, Father God, I miss you, your beard, your robes, your crown, but you have served us badly and let us humans down. So easy to disprove you and doubt your truthfulness, for you were just an idol that kept your power suppressed. For you are deep within us, revealed within our deeds, incarnate in our living and not within our creeds. No image cannot hold you, and if to one we hold, we keep some from your loving and leave them in the cold. Excluded groups are legion, disabled, female, gay. Old Father of the heavens, your picture moves away. Life's processes reveal you in prison, death and war, in people who are different, in gatherings of the poor. For Godding means encounter, gives dignity to all, has every shape and no shape in temple, tree and wall. So we will go a-Godding and birth you in our world. In open-hearted loving, we find your strength unfurled. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that in your journey you will find the kingdom of God, which and who is within you.
Right. I should be appearing now on the screen, and I don't appear to be appearing on the screen. It's all very strange. There we go. I'll pin my video for a minute. We have about 9 questions, so it seems that people have been, it's definitely stirred something and got people thinking, this talk. Thank you, June. So I'm going to pass over now to Dianna, and we have about just over 20 minutes until about 10 past 8, and we're going to ask June some questions from the chat. Well, Dianna is, and then we're going to, after that, I'm going to put everyone in breakout rooms, and you can have a nice chat about this or about anything else that you want. It'll be randomized breakout rooms for you to just have a casual chat. Now I'm going to unmute June, and I'm going to unmute Dianna, and hopefully this will all work. This is so much fun. Where is Dianna disappeared to now on my screen? If I unpin the video, she comes back when I unpin the video. Oh, hang on.
She's here.
She's here. Now I need to.
You just need to unmute her.
I just need to unmute her. Here she is. There we go. Brilliant.
Unmute. There we are. June, thank you so much. There's just so much there. We've got 9 questions in 20 minutes, but there's lots of other questions as well. So thank you. Fiona scooped them up together, and there's a great variety. So if you're ready, I'll just start with the first one. Where can I get a music thing like the lantern-shaped musical instrument? It sounds heavenly, looks gorgeous, loving the stories and song. Indeed, your instruments.
I'm going to have to put that, I fear. I should have anticipated this question. I'm going to have to put that on the website of Inclusive Church. They were originally made in France and are now being made in Australia. They are, I haven't even got it to hand, they are made so that, unlike the wind chimes, they've got tuned rods inside, and therefore you can get 6 or 7 different tunings called things like peace, sunrise, hope, and all of that. They're used often in rooms for the dying, for healing and for calming and so on. But I should have anticipated this question, and I'm sorry that I haven't got the Australian website for them, but I will give it to Ruth, and she can put them on the website to find where they are. They are very, very impressive, and they are now made in various forms, ones that can be used inside in various colours, and ones that can be used outside and are proof against the weather as well.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. We would very much appreciate that. This is different. You mentioned, June, someone putting together a service with lots of different people from different places. And as someone who's been live streaming and putting together pre-recorded services, I know that this takes a level of tech know-how in most of our churches don't have, and it takes more time than I have as a minister of 2 churches. Also, many in the church are not online. And don't we want to be so that they're not excluded?
Well, I think there are a number of questions there. The original one that I was referring to was done live, and people were scattered around the cathedral, and they did sing when they thought it was right, but they did sing together on a single note, which was shalom, and they and so on. So you had the greatest diversity possible and the greatest unity possible there. Online, as you the reproduction of that, I know Julie Shaw's here, and who's part of that group. We now do it online with people using the same chants, which are sets of peace chants, which are all over the same chord, and we improvise over those chants. And we have had Jews from Jerusalem, a wonderful Muslim singer from Canada, and a Hindu. So we've had all that mixture, but now, in a sense, starting on a single note, but then panning out and so on. That works on the Zoom platform. We don't try and synchronize the pulse, which you can't do, but we work over a drone. And that's been a huge experiment, which we've been about 2 or 3 months. Again, we'll put the details of that on the website. It's called Zoom Space for Peace. The business of online and exclusion, I think, is a serious one. And I mean, I'm an older person now, an elder, and I've managed to learn all the, and so on. And I think there are a lot of my generation who are very resistant to even starting, and I can understand that. I'm busy for Fiona and the work I'm doing with disability, learning now the programs which will enable me to manipulate sounds. And it took my granddaughter to tell me that I could do it. Come on, Grandma, you've learned so much already, for goodness sake, get on. So I am. But I think the biggest thing the church will have to do now is to mobilize its teenage and 20s people, the tech-savvy people. I think there's a huge case for having a bank of laptops in the church. And certainly one of our young people in All Saints Tooting has offered to teach people and to have classes in church to actually, I think this is one of the big things the church should really address. They've got to get over the phobia, and then they've got to mobilize their young people into teaching. And I think that's important, because we've heard a lot about loneliness and isolation. I can face getting older much better now that I can master Zoom. And I think there's a huge calling. I don't hear people talking about it. People say, well, what do you do? As if it's stuck like that. It's a huge program of that sort of work. And the other thing it does is bring the generations together. It brings the young people together with the older people. And both of them have to learn from one another. So I think that's it's a hugely important way forward.
Thank you. I've got a theory that if every single piece of kit we bought came with a free 7-year-old, then we could have everything set up, and then 7-year-olds are recycled and they can do it in an instant. So I like your idea very much of the younger generation working and learning from the older generation as they're together.
I think in social policy, if what the government is doing is issuing a laptop to every young person who's in a family that hasn't got one so that they can be online for school, they should do exactly the same thing for all the old people who have older people, or even the people, anybody who hasn't got that. It should be something that our age should really address, because the inability to manage it is actually a hugely exclusive thing. So it's not isn't it dreadful, what do we do? We've got to, in fact, to address the making people able to handle it.
Thank you, June. As a question about the chaos that you mentioned, and for some people, more than one sound at once can be quite disturbing or hard to distinguish. It makes learning difficult. By trying to include some tastes more, do we not then end up inadvertently excluding those for whom more chaos or cacophony is really difficult?
I think it's a very interesting question. It's one that came up with Space for Peace when we were doing it in the cathedral. Some people loved the chaos of the middle. They thought this was wonderful. It was free. It was Carnival. Some people hated it. They couldn't bear it. And they loved it coming down. Some people thought that coming down onto a single sound was boring, and so on. So I think you're right. Some people, but I think in a sense, life is often very chaotic. So I think to find ways of handling that is important. Now, one of the things we've addressed in the St. Martin's service that Fiona and I have had many discussions about is the use of music in that way, which can be overstimulating for some people who are neurodiverse, and indeed people who aren't neurodiverse, and so on. And I think if you're going to do that, then there have to be periods of silence. There have to, one has to have a balance of what's going to go on in it. And that's what I felt with Space for Peace. We did have that middle section, which appeared somewhat chaotic. And then we had a very ordered section with processions of candles and so on, moving and so on. And what we're going to do for Holocaust Memorial Day is to do that online, and there'll be periods of silence as well as periods of sound. So I think there always has to be a balance. I'm not suggesting we have eternal carnival as liturgy, but we do in fact have a balance between the two and are aware of people who find it difficult. Now, if you take the middle section of Space for Peace, some people simply sat on a chair for the entire thing. And that was their way and prayed, in fact, allowing it all to happen. So I think I'm not suggesting that we have this huge, overstimulating worship all the time. And we haven't had many times. I mean, I know in the rubric of the Eucharist, there will be a period of silence. Well, blink and you miss it in many interpretations. So I do try and leave longer periods of silence when I am celebrating. But we're so afraid of silence. We're afraid of silence because our world is so sound filled, but also because, of course, silence reminds us that we're dying. And that's what we're not prepared to look at in our culture. It's very difficult for us to look at dying. And I'm very grateful to St. James's Piccadilly, which is instituting the Death Cafe. And I know that Maureen, who's here, has been involved in that. But the problem with silence is that it is, in the end, the only time that we as human beings will be silent is actually when we die, because our bodies are making sounds all the time, and if they don't, then we're not living anymore. So there's a huge question around how we introduce silence and so on. And I'm horrified as a musician saying we're now going to have a period of silence, and they put on a piece of music. I think.
Yes. Thank you very much. That's not silence. That's music. You've touched on those for whom the silence is frightening. What about those for whom the uncertainty of Carnival is frightening? And the question is, the prospect of change may be unthinkable for those who hold power. How can we encourage them for whom it's the Carnival that's frightening rather than the silence?
Well, I think it's a very important point, and I think our society is very uncomfortable with uncertainty of any kind. All our education, so-called, is designed to reduce uncertainty. So we have tick boxes which say this is right, that is wrong, and so on and so forth. So, but actually the truth is that truth is much more uncertain than our education system would have us believe. We're no good at paradox and all of that. So I think there's a more fundamental cultural problem around uncertainty, which means that the pandemic caused huge waves because we were uncertain. And we're not used to uncertainty. We like to be certain. I think there's a huge case for, as we used to have, the 1662 prayer book at 8 o'clock in the morning for those people who want it, and all the services for that. But there's also a case for services where there is more Carnival and so on. But then we need to look at what is there and so on, and how we do it and how we introduce it and so on. But I'm not sure whether we go to church. In fact, it was the original lecture that I gave Ruth, was called A Little of What You Fancy Does You Good. Is that what liturgy is? A little of what you fancy? Or should you in liturgy be confronted with the things which are difficult and in fact be able to deal with those in some way? Because if it's a little of what you fancy does you good, then all we're doing is being confirmed in where we are and not moving anywhere at all. It's often uncertainty that enables us to move on in some way and learn. And so the apophatic tradition, the unknowingness of God, is being completely dismissed from much of Protestant worship. We want to be clear about it. And the story I didn't tell, but I will tell now because I love it. The Roman Catholic and the Orthodox and the Protestant went up to heaven, and Peter greeted them. And the Orthodox asked the way to the icons, the Roman Catholic to the Virgin Mary, and the Protestant said, "Which page are we on?" So, it's so heavily controlled, by a book. And now that I can't stand, I get terribly cross when the book says stand or, I mean, let me choose what I do.
And for those who are responsible for shaping liturgy or liturgical opportunities, how can we move beyond being simply gatekeepers to being able to facilitate that church and worship where all can participate? Is it a false goal to think that one act of service could include everyone, or is it in fact better to have a variety of offering that doesn't require so much of a gatekeeper?
Well, I think this is where we get to radical hospitality, which is often, let's make everybody welcome, and if we're not in a pandemic, have a cup of tea. I think it really means sitting down with small groups of the congregation and saying, you know, what would you like to offer, what can you offer, and so on and so forth. And I think that, you know, our worship has been much too highly controlled by a small group of people and so on. In fact, if I was being really radical, I think I like the notion that, you know, everybody should be ordained in the church to do a particular job. So when you decide to join, you're ordained to repair the roof, or and so that would be the real priesthood of all believers. And some people are ordained to do the consecration. And the notion that everybody who is committed has something that they have to offer, that they can offer in some way. But it means sitting down and getting to know people and so on. And then you're right, the manager of the liturgy will make mistakes from time to time and get it wrong. And any change causes that. Is there a liturgy where everybody can do everything all the time? Probably not. But there is a liturgy over the course of a year where everybody can do something, and so on. So, but we haven't really looked at what really radical hospitality is. What has everybody got to offer? And that doesn't mean necessarily leading the intercessions, though it might. It may be, you know, sitting quietly and holding the hand of somebody who's lonely. It could be, you know, a whole range of things, but or, you know, preparing the knitting, as Rachel Noel does, you know, putting the wool out before the service, all of that. But we, you know, we've got locked into, I mean, we do include the congregation, but only in the ways that we set up.
There's different kinds of icons we set up. The question we have about it starts with the statement, there's a value in iconoclasm, but what do we replace our images with? And of course, that's been raised for us the world over by Black Lives Matter, of images being replaced on empty plinths or empty plinths living. Does the church need icons?
I think it's an interesting question, and the last hymn I sang, in a sense, offers, I think, the two positions that we're in. Either we have a multitude of images for God, as many as we can think of, or we don't have any at all. We go down the Jewish Islamic route and just have patterns and so on. At the moment, we're stuck with a very limited range of icons that we use, and that has been exclusive. And I wouldn't want to smash the roof of the Sistine Chapel. I would want it to take its place alongside other images. Some of you will have seen, I know I used it in St. Martin's, you know, the wheelchair God, you know, reaching down. And that it needs, but it would require a huge rethinking of our spaces. And so on. I mean, where is the pregnant Virgin Mary? I know people can always point to 3, but I mean, even that would be a larger woman than the average Virgin Mary that we see, who appears to have gone on a diet always. I mean, that was the book I Shall Never Write. It was when I went to Malta, saw the big fertility goddesses looking like me, and then looked at the images of the Virgin Mary. And the book I Shall Never Write is called When the Goddess Went on a Diet.
We look forward to that book in your vast spare time. We've got just a couple more. I'm aware of the time, and I've got Ruth's going to stare at me in a minute. But could you define what you mean by queer the liturgy, please?
Well, queering means looking. The verb is usually used looking at the gaps, the meshes, the holes in it, and so on, which is what I've tried to do. Where are the holes? Where are the missing bits? So queering is, you know, allowing Lucy to go across the front on her scooter and seeing that as part of the liturgy, and not an intrusion on it. It is, you're looking seriously at how people are included. So queering looks at what we're doing and says, where are the holes in it? Where are the mesh? Where is the mesh? Where is the net? And so on. So it's the word queering is usually used in that way, to see where the holes are and what the possibilities are in the holes and the bits that are missing.
And perhaps something about what is driving a hole through the liturgy, as Lucy might have done on the scooter.
Absolutely.
Creating something new.
Yes, I think it's an interesting one, the notion of queering. One of the books that I've edited is called Queering Freedom, which is on sexuality, gender, and spirituality in the church, which is where the Bertram Sher comes from. I mean, I am a musician. Why are we all trying to sing in unison? Why can't we sing exactly where we are? Why can't we sing the same tune in all sorts of different ways and elaborate it? And it's been a disaster. And I do agree with, I mean, I love the sound of King's College, Cambridge, but I have lots and lots of questions about what it's done for ordinary people in ordinary parishes and made them feel that they can't do it.
I think that's been, for me, very, very helpful to hear, as I have the privilege of leading a cathedral. Absolutely. And of course, excellence is the watchword. But our cathedral is a modern cathedral. We say we're modern with manners. And our director of music, who's the only woman director of music.
That's right, I know her.
And she is a specialist in contemporary composers. And so to me, who loves the Victoriana, I just think they're singing notes. It's just, but they're doing their absolute best. And it's the right thing for the time. It's authentic for us. And I think that authenticity is really quite important too for the people. Like if someone had a scooter or was knitting, that's authentic for that group of people as they're offering their worship to God. And just before breakout rooms, this is something we all want to ask you, and someone's had the gumption to write it. Does your necklace have a story, which is, we think it's gorgeous?
Well, my necklace does have a story, because I am an extraordinary professor, as you said, in South Africa. And in the shopping mall, which I go to in Potchefstroom, where the university is, the indigenous women of the area come and they set up their stalls all along the middle of the shopping mall. So the Western shops are in the shopping mall, and they come with all, this is the beadwork that they do. And last time I went there, the woman who I know quite well was there, and I always buy lots of things for people, including this necklace. And she'd had a really, really bad day, and she said, you know, I'd enabled her, she said, to feed her family by buying these beads. And I called her the bead lady, and I go and see her every time I'm in Northwest University to buy these wonderful beads. And she's my friend, and she's a bead lady, and I love her. And the project that we're doing in South Africa, which is the next book called Ritualized Belonging, the university has had a large grant from the government, over several million rand, in order to integrate the races, which is so needed in South Africa as a legacy of apartheid. So that notion of getting to know the variety of cultures. And for me, this necklace is the sign of wearing the beads of South Africa and acknowledging my position as a professor in South Africa, even though I'm coming from one of the colonial powers and so on. But sometimes it's easier to say from outside some of the things that's more difficult to say on the inside. And I have a great privilege there of being able to work in a variety of communities. And I've been taught so much. One of the things that I'm really interested in is looking at the position of the sagoma there, the traditional healers, and the frames that they're using, and so on. But that's another story. But it's all about inclusion. And for me, music is a marvelous way of looking at that. But underneath it lies a theology. It lies a revisiting, I think, the way in which we've twisted the narrative and the message of Jesus into shapes which have been counterproductive in the agenda of inclusion. That's what I've tried to say, and I hope that I've said it as clearly as I can.
Thank you very much, June.